Welcome to the Fundamentals of Fitness. I'm Alison, your performance coach, educator, and founder of AB Performance Training and Coaching. This is the podcast where we strip away the noise, extremes, and surface level advice and return to the science-backed fundamentals that build real strength, real health, and long-term performance. Because progress doesn't happen by accident. It happens through adaptation. But here's something most people misunderstand about adaptation. Your body doesn't actually want to change. It wants to stay the same. Your physiology is designed to maintain stability, to conserve energy, and to protect survival. Which means that every time you try to change your body, whether through fat loss, strength training, endurance, or improving fitness overall, your body initially resists. Not because it's broken, not because you're doing something wrong, but because that resistance is part of how human physiology works. And today we're going to explore something called the adaptation curve. Because once you understand how adaptation works, frustration in training starts to make a lot more sense and progress becomes far more predictable. So pop on those trainers or grab that cuppa and let's dive right in. One of the most important concepts in physiology is homeostasis. And homeostasis simply means maintaining internal stability. Your body regulates temperature, blood glucose, hormone levels, hydration, energy balance, all within relatively narrow ranges. These systems exist because stability is essential for survival. Your body doesn't know you're trying to build muscle or lose body fat. It only knows whether conditions feel safe or threatening. So when you introduce a training stimulus, like lifting weights or running, the body experiences that as stress, and stress triggers adaptation. But before adaptation occurs, there's usually resistance, because the body first tries to maintain the status quo. So when someone begins lifting, the first few sessions often feel extremely difficult. Your muscles may be really sore, your coordination feels awkward, strength is low. But after a few weeks, those same movements feel easier. This is adaptation in action. The body has reorganized itself in response to the repeated stress. But that adaptation only happened because the stimulus was repeated consistently. Many new clients feel discouraged during the first few weeks of training. Everything feels hard. Progress seems quite slow, and it's easy to assume something just isn't working. But in reality, the body is simply adjusting. Your nervous system coordination is improving and your muscles are learning the movement patterns. And that early discomfort is part of the adaptation process. So the first stage of any training program often feels the hardest, not because you're failing, but because the body hasn't adapted just yet. If we plotted adaptation over time, it wouldn't look like a straight line. Instead, it would look like a curve. At first, progress can be quite rapid. Beginners often gain strength quite quickly, and fitness can improve noticeably. This is something called the novice effect, or in some cases, beginner's luck. But over time, progress can slow down, not because training stopped working, but because the body has already adapted to the easiest changes. Further improvements require more precise stimuli. A beginner lifter might add weight to the bar every week. An advanced lifter might take months to increase a lift by a small amount. Both are progressing, but the rate of adaptation is different because the body is already highly adapted. Eventually, most training journeys include a plateau. Strength can stall and fat loss can slow. Performance seems to stop improving. This stage is incredibly common and it's where many people quit. But plateaus are not signs of failure. They're signs that the body has stabilized. And stability is exactly what physiology aims for. Plateaus are not problems. They are signals that your body has adapted to the current stimulus. But adaptation itself is a fascinating process. Because when your body adapts, it doesn't just get stronger or fitter in a vague way, it becomes more efficient. And efficiency from a biological perspective means doing the same task with less stress and less energy cost, which is incredibly useful for survival, but slightly inconvenient if your goal is continuous progress. Let's take a simple example. Imagine the first time you do a new strength exercise, perhaps something like a Romanian deadlift or a squat variation you've never performed before. The first session might feel awkward. Your balance isn't quite right. The movement pattern feels unfamiliar, and you might feel soreness in muscles you didn't even know existed. That first experience is your nervous system encountering a new demand. Your brain is learning how to coordinate muscles more efficiently. Your joints are adjusting to the load, and your muscles are experiencing a stimulus they haven't encountered before. Over the next few sessions, something interesting happens. The movement becomes smoother, your coordination improves, the same weight starts to feel easier, and soreness reduces. Your body hasn't just got stronger, it has adapted neurologically and mechanically. Your nervous system has refined the movement, and your muscles have improved their recruitment pattern. Your connective tissue has started adapting to the load, and the overall cost of performing the movement has decreased. This is the adaptation curve beginning to take shape. So athletes experience this process constantly. If a tennis player practices a new serve technique, the first few sessions often feel uncomfortable. Timing may be off, and the power may actually decrease temporarily. But with repetition, the nervous system refines the pattern, and eventually the movement becomes automatic, more efficient, more powerful, less mentally demanding. The same principle applies in the gym. Most physiological adaptations tend to follow 3 broad stages. The first stage is stress. This is where the body experiences something unfamiliar. Muscles fatigue, energy systems are challenged. The nervous system works harder to coordinate the movement. In this stage, the body is essentially saying, "This is new, I'm not fully prepared for this." The second stage is adaptation. This is where the body begins to adjust. Muscle fibers strengthen, neural coordination improves, and energy systems become more efficient. What once felt difficult becomes manageable. The third stage is stabilisation, and this is the stage where many people become frustrated, because stabilisation means the body has fully adapted to the stimulus. The exercise that once felt difficult now feels routine. Your body has learned the task, which means the stimulus is no longer producing the same levels of stress. And without stress, there is no further adaptation. I once worked with a client who had been doing exactly the same gym routine for well over a year. They'd been doing the same exercises, the same weights, the same repetitions. Every session felt comfortable, which sounds positive. But the problem was that progress had completely stopped. Not because the routine was bad, but because the body had adapted fully. The stimulus was no longer challenging enough to trigger change. When we introduced small adjustments, slightly heavier loads, different rep ranges, new exercise variations, her progress resumed because the body had been given a new stimulus to adapt to. So let's think about your own training routine. Have you ever reached a point where the workout that once felt challenging now feels automatic? Where the weights feel familiar, the exercise feels predictable, and the effort feels manageable? That's adaptation. And adaptation is a success, but it also means the next stage of progress requires a new challenge. This is also why beginners often see rapid improvements in the early stages of training. When someone is new to strength training, almost everything is a new stimulus. The muscles are learning how to produce force. The nervous system is learning how to coordinate movement. Energy systems are improving. Even relatively small training loads can create significant adaptation. But as training experience increases, the body becomes more specialized. It becomes more efficient, which means larger or more specific stimuli are required to produce further change. This is why progress slows over time. Not because your body is stubborn, but because it's already adapted to many of the easiest improvements. If you look at elite athletes, improvements are often measured in very small margins. A sprinter might spend months trying to improve their time by just a fraction of a second. A strength athlete might train for an entire year to add a few kilos to a lift. Because once the body is highly adapted, improvements become more incremental. But those small improvements still matter, and they accumulate over time. So what does this mean for you? Understanding the adaptation curve removes a lot of unnecessary frustration, because when progress slows, it doesn't mean the progress has stopped or the program has failed. It means the body has adapted, and adaptation is the goal. But once adaptation occurs, the stimulus must evolve if the progress is to continue. There are several reasons why progress slows as training experience increases. The first is diminishing returns. When someone starts training from a relatively untrained state, almost every stimulus produces improvements. But as the body becomes stronger and fitter, improvements require more specific training. The second factor is energy efficiency. Your body becomes more efficient at performing tasks. For example, a runner who once found a 5-kilometre run exhausting may eventually perform that same run with much less effort. The body has adapted, which means that the same stimulus produces less stress, and less stress means less adaptation. Endurance athletes increase training volume gradually over time because the body adapts to previous workloads, and if the workload stays the same forever, progress can stop. So the training must evolve, not randomly, but intelligently. A client might initially lose fat quickly, but after several months, weight loss could slow. This doesn't mean fat loss has stopped. It often means the body has adjusted metabolically. Energy expenditure changes and hunger signals change, and the deficit becomes smaller relative to the body size. This is part of the adaptation process. So what does this mean for you? Progress slowing is not failure. It's physiology doing exactly what it's designed to do. And this is where understanding adaptation becomes incredibly helpful. Because when people don't understand this process, they often interpret slowed progress as failure. They assume they're doing something wrong. They assume the program has stopped working, or they assume that they simply lack discipline. But in many cases, none of those things are true. What's actually happening is that the body is simply becoming very good at what you've been asking it to do. Your body has learned the task, and once the body learns the task, it tries to perform that task with as little energy cost as possible. From a biological perspective, efficiency is a survival advantage. If our ancestors had to work extremely hard every time they walked, ran, or carried something, survival would have been much more difficult. So the body evolved to make repeated tasks easier over time, and this is exactly what happens in training. The exercises that once felt exhausting eventually become routine. The runs that once felt long eventually feel manageable, and the weights that once felt heavy eventually feel normal. Your body is becoming more efficient, and efficiency is a form of adaptation. Endurance athletes talk about something called running economy. This refers to how efficiently the body uses oxygen whilst running. Two athletes might run at exactly the same speed, but one athlete might use less oxygen to maintain that pace. That athlete is more efficient, and efficiency means they can sustain effort for longer. But the interesting thing about running economy is that it improves through training. The body learns to perform the task more smoothly, more economically, with less wasted movement. And strength training works in a similar way. At first, your body struggles with coordination, but as you practice the movement, your nervous system becomes more efficient at recruiting the right muscles. The movement becomes smoother, more controlled, less energy is wasted. And that efficiency is exactly what allows you to lift heavier loads over time. I once had a client who told me that her workouts had become too easy. She'd been following the same routine for several months. And whilst her routine had initially produced great results, eventually it felt comfortable, predictable, almost automatic. At first, she assumed this meant her program had become ineffective. But what had actually happened was that her body had fully adapted to the training stimulus. Her nervous system knew the movements. Her muscles had adapted to the load. Her energy systems had adjusted to the demands. So the same routine simply wasn't producing the same level of stress anymore. Once we introduced small changes, slightly different exercises, new rep ranges, and modest increases in load, progress started again because the body had been given something new to respond to. Think about your own training for a moment. Have you ever reached a point where a routine that once felt difficult suddenly felt easy? Where the same exercises feel predictable? Where you can complete the session without really feeling challenged? That moment isn't failure, it's evidence of adaptation. Your body has learned the task, and once the task is learned, the stimulus must evolve if progress is going to continue. But here's something important for you to understand. Adaptation doesn't mean you should constantly chase novelty. Some people respond to plateaus by changing everything. New exercises every week, completely different programs, constant variation. But too much variation can actually slow progress because the body needs repeated exposure to a stimulus before meaningful adaptation occurs. So the goal is not chaos. The goal is progressive evolution, gradually increasing the challenge, gradually introducing new stimuli, and allowing the body time to respond. When progress slows, it doesn't necessarily mean the plan has failed. It usually means the body's adapted to the current stimulus. And the adaptation is actually a sign that training has been very effective. The next step isn't panic, it's progression, a slightly heavier load, a slightly different rep range, a new exercise variation, or a shift in training emphasis. Small changes, but meaningful ones, because the body adapts best when stress increases gradually and intelligently. And once you begin to see training through this lens, plateaus stop feeling like roadblocks. They start to look more like checkpoints in the adaptation process, signals that your body has successfully adjusted and that it may now be ready for the next challenge. So once you understand the adaptation curve, your approach to training changes. Instead of expecting constant rapid progress, you begin to think long-term. You recognize that improvements happen in waves, periods of progress, periods of consolidation, periods of slower change. Athletes structure their training around this reality. They use periodization. They change training variables over time. They manage fatigue, and they allow for recovery phases. In professional sports, training is rarely identical all year round. There are these phases: base training, intensity blocks, competition preparation, recovery phases. Each phase creates different adaptations because the body needs variation to continue improving. You don't need a complex elite program to benefit from this idea. Even simple adjustments can help. Changing repetition ranges, adjusting your training intensity, introducing new exercises, and adding recovery weeks. These changes introduce new stimuli, and new stimuli encourages new adaptations. If your progress has slowed recently, ask yourself, has my training stimulus changed recently? Or has my body simply adapted to what I've been doing? Because adaptation is not the enemy, it's the goal. But once adaptation occurs, the stimulus must evolve. The adaptation curve explains why progress rarely happens in straight lines. Your body resists changes initially, but then it adapts, and then it stabilizes. And each new phase of progress requires a slightly different stimulus. Understanding this removes a lot of frustration from your training, because when progress slows, you no longer assume something is wrong. You recognize that your body has simply adapted, and adaptation means it's time to evolve the stimulus, not abandon the process. I really want to thank you for joining me today. And if this episode has helped you understand why progress sometimes slows, share it with someone who feels frustrated with their training. Because often the problem isn't effort, it's misunderstanding how adaptation actually works. And if you're building long-term strength, health, and performance, make sure you're following the fundamentals of fitness so you don't miss the next episode. Next time, we're going to explore pain versus injury and how to train intelligently through discomfort without causing harm. Until then, Train with structure, recover with intention, and build something strong that lasts. I'll see you next week.